At 3 minutes past 6 in the morning, my mother-in-law stood in my driveway, wearing an expensive tracksuit and no makeup. She offered no explanation. She simply looked at me and said not to go home today. By evening, I stood locked out of my own house, watching a stranger hold my keys. My husband had set a perfect paper trap, but he forgot that I make my living finding fatal flaws in airtight systems. My name is Clare Walsh. I am 36 years old, and I live in the Dilworth neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina. Under normal circumstances, I am a woman who trusts the ground she walks on because I have meticulously checked the foundation. As the Director of Supplier Risk Management for Halcyon Freight Grid, an infrastructure logistics company, my entire professional existence revolves around anticipating disaster. I spend my days buried in data, identifying the subtle, often invisible fractures in global supply chains. I look for the missing invoices, the sudden shifts in vendor behavior, the quiet transfers of liability. I am intimately familiar with numbers, rigid processes, and everything that can be definitively proven on paper. I get paid a very comfortable salary to know when a system is lying to me. Yet, I completely missed the collapse of my own life. It started at exactly 3 minutes past 6 in the morning. The sun had barely begun to break over the canopy of ancient oak trees that line our street. I was in the kitchen, pouring my first cup of coffee, mentally reviewing a quarterly audit report, when I heard the sharp, authoritative knock at the front door. We do not get unannounced visitors in Dilworth at 6 in the morning. I set my mug down on the marble island, pulled my silk robe tighter around my shoulders, and walked down the hallway. When I opened the heavy wooden door, the morning humidity instantly clung to my skin. Standing on my front porch was Judith Mercer. My mother-in-law was a woman who practically breathed Southern aristocratic control. She was the kind of woman who never allowed the world to see her anything less than impeccably styled, armed with a polite but lethal smile. But the woman standing before me was different. Judith wore a dark, expensive zip-up tracksuit. Her face was entirely bare of makeup, exposing the fine lines and exhaustion she usually kept hidden beneath premium cosmetics. Her posture was rigid, and she looked exactly like someone who had just stepped out of a sleepless, agonizing night. She did not step inside. She did not offer a polite greeting or apologize for the absurd hour. She simply stood on the threshold, her eyes locked onto mine, carrying a weight I had never seen in her before. "Clare," she said. Her voice was incredibly quiet, yet it cut through the damp morning air with absolute clarity. "Do not go home today." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the rest of the sentence. I asked her what she was talking about. I asked if something had happened. My immediate instinct was to categorize this as just another psychological power play from the Mercer family. My marriage to her son, Grant Mercer, had been slowly disintegrating for the better part of a year. The cracks in our foundation were deep and entirely rooted in the Mercer philosophy of money, power, and perception. Grant was a man who demanded the appearance of overwhelming success, often at the expense of actual stability. For months, we had engaged in exhausting circular arguments behind closed doors regarding his business practices. He was constantly moving money, securing new lines of credit, and hiding behind financial maneuvers he dismissively referred to as temporary structures. I wanted transparency. He demanded blind loyalty. The tension in our house had become a physical presence, a heavy fog we navigated every single day. I assumed Judith had caught wind of our latest fight and was here to deliver some cryptic, manipulative warning to keep me in line. But Judith did not blink. She did not soften. She looked past me into the foyer of the house, then brought her gaze back to my face. "Stay in public," she instructed, her tone perfectly flat. "Keep your phone on. Do not go back before dark." Without waiting for a response, she turned around, walked briskly down the brick pathway, and climbed into her dark luxury sedan parked idling at the curb. I stood frozen in the open doorway, watching her taillights disappear around the corner. A cold, deeply unsettling feeling began to spread through my chest. The kind of physical chill that raises the hair on your arms and tells your nervous system that something is fundamentally wrong. I closed the door and locked it. The house was entirely silent, too silent. Grant had left the house before 5 in the morning. He had briefly stood in the doorway of our bedroom, adjusting his tie in the dim light, and muttered something about an emergency breakfast meeting with a new group of investors. Our 13-year-old son, Noah, was also gone. I pulled out my phone and found a text message from Judith sent at 5:15 in the morning. It stated she had decided to pick Noah up early for a special breakfast before dropping him off at his middle school. It was an abrupt deviation from our normal schedule, but I had been too tired to argue with it at the time. Now, standing in the empty hallway, the absence of my husband and my son felt less like a coincidence and more like a coordinated evacuation. I forced myself to breathe. I told myself I was letting my professional paranoia bleed into my personal life. I went upstairs, took a shower, dressed in my standard corporate armor of a tailored blazer and slacks, and grabbed my briefcase. I walked out the door, got into my car, and began my commute toward the city center. The drive from Dilworth to the Halcyon Freight Grid headquarters usually takes about 20 minutes. I decided to stop at a local drive-thru for an espresso to shake off the lingering dread. I pulled up to the window and handed the young barista my credit card. It was the secondary card attached to the joint account Grant and I shared for household expenses. The barista swiped it, frowned, and swiped it again. She looked up at me with an apologetic smile and told me the card had been declined. I felt a flash of irritation. I assumed Grant was being petty, perhaps restricting the account after our argument the night before to make some sort of dominant point about who controlled the primary finances. I handed the barista my personal corporate card, paid for the coffee, and drove away, my jaw tight with frustration. 10 minutes later, while sitting in morning gridlock on Interstate 277, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. I glanced down at the screen. It was an automated push notification from the smart home security application we use to control the locks, cameras, and thermostat of our house. The alert read, "Primary administrator privileges have been successfully transferred to a new user." I picked up the phone and opened the application. I attempted to log in using my standard credentials. The screen flashed red. Access denied. Invalid password. I tried to reset the password, but the system informed me that my email address was no longer associated with the master account. The digital keys to my own home had just been quietly revoked while I was sitting in traffic. My pulse began to accelerate. The irritation I felt at the coffee shop instantly hardened into genuine alarm. I pulled into the underground parking deck of the Halcyon building, found my reserved spot, and shifted the car into park. Before getting out, I opened my personal email application to look for a security alert from the smart home company. There was no alert from the security company. Instead, sitting at the top of my inbox, unread, was an automated message from the county utility service. The subject line was brief and bureaucratic. It was a notification regarding our home address. I tapped the email. The message stated, "We have received and are processing your request to update the primary resident on file for this service address. If you did not authorize this change, please contact customer support during normal business hours." I sat in the dim light of the parking garage, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The engine was off, but I could hear the loud, frantic beating of my own heart. I tried one last time to rationally explain what was happening. I tried to tell myself this was merely an aggressive divorce tactic. Grant was angry. He was trying to inconvenience me, to squeeze me out, to make me feel small and powerless. But the director of supplier risk management knew better. My entire career was built on recognizing the moment a pattern of small errors transforms into a deliberate, catastrophic fraud. A declined credit card is an annoyance. A changed password is a red flag. But a formal request to alter the municipal residency records of a property is a legal maneuver. Judith's voice echoed in the quiet space of my car. "Do not go home today." This was not an argument. This was not a petty fight over money. This was a systematic, calculated erasure. Someone was actively dismantling my digital and legal presence in my own home, step by step, right in the middle of a perfectly normal Tuesday morning, and they were relying on my absence to get away with it. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I realized with absolute, chilling clarity that the life I had woken up to just 2 hours ago no longer existed. The paper trail of my existence was being rewritten, and I was suddenly a spectator to my own eviction. The workday had been a grueling exercise in sustained compartmentalization. I sat through 3 consecutive strategy meetings and reviewed dozens of vendor contracts while a quiet, violent storm of adrenaline wrecked my nervous system. By the time I finally left the corporate campus and merged onto the main highway, the sky above Charlotte had bruised into a deep, heavy purple. It was nearing 6 in the evening. The cold, logical part of my brain screamed at me to heed the warning delivered earlier that morning, to simply check into a downtown hotel and immediately call an attorney. But the primal, territorial instinct of a woman whose sanctuary was actively under siege forced my foot down heavily on the accelerator. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to know exactly what kind of elaborate game was being played on my own property. I turned onto our quiet residential street and immediately had to slam on the brakes. My house, the classic Center Hall colonial I had painstakingly renovated over 2 years, was lit up like an active crime scene. Every single exterior floodlight was blazing aggressively against the encroaching dusk, casting harsh shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. This visual assault was accompanied by a fleet of vehicles that absolutely did not belong in my driveway. A white commercial van with the name of a local locksmith stenciled in bold blue lettering across the side was idling loudly against the curb. Right behind it sat a compact gray sedan bearing the discreet, professional logo of a residential property appraisal firm. Flanking the closed garage doors were 2 dark, unfamiliar sport utility vehicles. I parked my car haphazardly on the street, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I gripped the heavy door handle. The humid Carolina evening air felt thick, almost entirely unbreathable, as I stepped out onto the pavement. My heels clicked loudly against the asphalt, creating a sharp, erratic rhythm that perfectly mirrored my racing pulse. As I slowly approached the edge of the lawn, the true, horrifying scope of the ambush materialized in front of me. Standing squarely on the center of my wide brick front porch was a uniformed deputy from the county sheriff's department. He had his thumbs hooked casually into his heavy leather utility belt, projecting an air of absolute routine authority. He watched me walk up the slate path, his expression neutral but intensely observant. He stepped forward and raised a hand, his voice carrying the polite but immovable weight of law enforcement. He instructed me to stop exactly where I was. I froze at the base of the brick steps. I looked at the shiny silver badge pinned to his chest, then up to his stern face. I told him clearly that I lived here. I stated that this was my home and I had the absolute right to enter. He replied smoothly that tonight I did not have that right. He informed me that he held an emergency temporary protective order, issued by a county judge just a few hours ago at the specific request of my husband. He stated that I was legally required to vacate the premises immediately and maintain a strict distance of 500 feet from the property line. The heavy words hit me with the intense physical force of a blow directly to the chest. A protective order. The ultimate legal weapon, a tool typically reserved for genuine victims of domestic violence, was now being ruthlessly wielded as a swift administrative guillotine against me. I felt all the blood drain rapidly from my face. I looked past the broad shoulder of the deputy toward the heavy oak front door. The door was open just a few inches. Standing inside the dimly lit foyer, safely behind the threshold and the protective badge of the law, was Grant. He had orchestrated his physical appearance with the exact same meticulous attention to detail he always applied to his high-stakes investor pitches. His expensive custom dress shirt was slightly rumpled, the sleeves carefully rolled up to his elbows, the top 2 buttons undone to suggest extreme emotional duress. He rubbed his face slowly, wearing a mask of profound, tragic exhaustion. He looked exactly like a devastated, heartbroken father who had been forced to take extreme legal measures to shield his young son from an erratic, unstable spouse. He did not look angry or vindictive. He looked entirely resigned, which was the absolute most terrifying expression I had ever seen him wear in all our years together. It was a flawless performance, a masterpiece of manipulation designed specifically for the captive audience standing outside, and there certainly was an audience. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught the subtle, eager movements down the block. The young couple from 3 doors down was out walking their golden retriever, pausing entirely too long at the street corner under the pretense of adjusting a leash. The retired accountant across the street was diligently watering his perfectly hydrated hydrangeas. His gaze locked completely onto my driveway. They were all standing at a safe, calculated distance, far enough away to avoid being pulled into the messy crossfire, but close enough to absorb every single agonizing detail of my public humiliation. I realized with sickening absolute clarity that the neighborhood narrative was already permanently cemented. By tomorrow morning, the private group messages and tennis club whispers would all share the exact same accepted truth. Grant was the tragic, noble hero holding his fractured family together, and I was the volatile, dangerous wife who had to be physically escorted away by the police. My personal reputation in this community had been completely assassinated in a single, well-planned afternoon. I forced my attention away from the gawking neighbors and looked back at the interior of my house. From my low vantage point at the bottom of the steps, the narrow sightline through the partially open front door offered a devastating, calculated glimpse into the foyer and the long hallway beyond. The textured wall directly above the wainscoting, which had always been covered in a meticulously curated gallery of our framed family photographs, was completely bare. The small brass picture hook stood empty and useless against the pale beige paint. My gaze drifted slightly to the left, toward the open double doors of the front room we used as a shared study. The massive custom mahogany desk that I had used for countless late-night risk assessments was stripped entirely clean of my dual monitors, my client files, and my personal silver stationery set. Sitting squarely in the center of the polished hardwood floor were 3 identical brown cardboard boxes. Each box was tightly sealed with thick, clear packing tape. Someone had taken a thick black marker and scrawled the words "Personal Office" across the side of the nearest box in large, hurried letters. It was a carefully constructed stage set. It was the physical manifestation of a massive, elaborate lie. The entire house had been systematically scrubbed of my existence, arranged specifically to look as though I had packed up my life and abandoned my family long before this humid evening. As I stood there absorbing the sheer, breathtaking scale of the violation, the front door opened slightly wider. A man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit squeezed past Grant and stepped out onto the wide porch. He was clutching a bulky aluminum clipboard tightly against his chest. He looked extremely flustered, clearly eager to escape the suffocating, tense atmosphere of the house. As he hurried down the brick steps, pushing quickly past the deputy, he fumbled awkwardly with his pen. For just a fraction of a second, the heavy clipboard tilted downward toward me. My eyes, thoroughly trained by years of scanning dense corporate legal documents for hidden liabilities and quiet clauses, instantly caught the bold black heading printed across the very top of his form. The text read, "Owner Occupancy Review." The man realized his error, quickly flipped the paper face down against his side, and practically ran to the gray sedan parked on the street. All the air vanished instantly from my lungs. The disconnected, confusing pieces of the morning violently slammed together in my mind, forming a horrifying, crystal-clear picture of reality. The declined credit card at the coffee shop, the revoked smart home access while I sat in traffic, the sudden change of residency email from the county, and now, a licensed property appraiser actively confirming sole occupancy, while a commercial locksmith changed all the deadbolts under the watchful supervision of the police. Judith had not been warning me to protect my fragile feelings. She had been warning me because she knew the precise, mechanical nature of the trap her son had set. Grant did not merely want me out of the house for the night. He desperately needed the house to look a very specific, curated way for that appraiser. He needed a formal, legally binding documented record proving that he was the sole occupant and that his wife had permanently vacated the property. But much more importantly, he needed a judge to sign a piece of paper legally barring me from the premises, ensuring absolutely that I could not walk through the door and disrupt the false narrative he was building for the bank. He needed one full, uninterrupted business day to transform our shared marital home into a piece of pristine, unencumbered financial collateral. My sudden absence was not an unfortunate byproduct of his aggressive legal plan. My forced absence was the fundamental core requirement of the entire fraudulent scheme. I stood alone on the sidewalk, the heavy evening humidity pressing down on my shoulders, staring silently at the man I had married. He looked back at me from the shadows of the hallway, a tiny flicker of cold, calculated triumph dancing just behind his exhausted, pathetic facade. He truly thought he had won the war on the first day. He thought he had successfully neutralized the biggest threat to his plan by locking me out and thoroughly humiliating me in front of our entire neighborhood. He believed his fabricated paper trail was flawless and airtight. He was completely wrong. He had successfully executed a brilliant, hostile takeover of my personal life, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his opponent. He thought he was dealing with an emotional, hysterical wife who would shatter under the weight of public embarrassment. He forgot that he was dealing with a woman who professionally dismantled complex, fraudulent systems for a living. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not beg the deputy to let me inside my own home. I simply turned around, walked calmly back to my car, and began planning my audit. I did not shed a single tear as I navigated my car away from the flashing lights of the sheriff cruiser. Crying is a biological response to sudden loss, but my brain had already categorized this event not as a tragedy, but as a hostile breach of protocol. I pulled onto the highway heading toward uptown Charlotte and engaged the Bluetooth system in my car. I dialed Tessa Boone. Tessa and I had shared a cramped dormitory in college before she evolved into one of the most ruthless family litigation attorneys in the entire state of North Carolina. She answered on the second ring, her background noise suggesting she was still at her firm. I gave her the bare, unvarnished facts. I was locked out of my own home. There was an active protective order. Strangers were inspecting the property under the guise of an appraisal. She did not offer useless sympathy. She told me to find a secure location, open my laptop, and wait for her to pull the county court docket. I drove straight to a high-rise business hotel right in the center of the financial district. I needed sterile efficiency, not comfort. I walked into the cavernous lobby, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the polished marble floors. I booked a corner suite for an indefinite period, paid up front with my corporate card, and took the elevator up to the 14th floor. The room was exactly what I required. It smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and stale air conditioning, devoid of any personal warmth. I dropped my keys on the granite counter, set my laptop on the glass desk, connected to the secure network, and watched the blinking cursor on my screen. I was no longer a wife locked out of her house. I was an auditor assessing a catastrophic system failure. 20 minutes later, my phone illuminated. Tessa had managed to pull the electronic filings Grant had submitted to the judge just hours prior. She read the contents aloud, her voice tight with professional outrage and disbelief. Grant had drafted a masterful piece of fabricated panic. The emergency petition explicitly accused me of abruptly abandoning the family home earlier that morning. It claimed I was exhibiting severe signs of financial distress, paranoia, and erratic behavior. Most dangerously, it alleged that I had made violent verbal threats to unilaterally liquidate our shared marital assets and flee the jurisdiction, forcing him to seek immediate legal protection for himself and our son. I pulled up a blank spreadsheet on my screen and asked Tessa to read the exact timestamps of my supposed manic episodes and violent threats listed in the sworn affidavit. As she rattled off the hours and minutes, a cold wave of realization washed over me. The timeline was not arbitrary. At 8:45 in the morning, when Grant claimed I had called him in a screaming rage to threaten our bank accounts, my employee badge had been scanning into the underground parking deck at the Halcyon Freight Grid headquarters. At 9:30, when he alleged under oath that I had stormed out of the house leaving Noah unsupervised, Network logs would definitively show I was actively logging into the corporate virtual private network from my designated desk. At 12:15, the exact moment the document stated I was packing bags in a frenzy and destroying property, I was swiping my company identification card to buy a turkey sandwich and a black coffee in the ground floor corporate cafeteria. Grant had not just invented a story out of thin air, he had meticulously weaponized my perfectly predictable corporate routine. He knew precisely where I would be, and exactly what digital footprints I would be leaving while he was busy swearing under penalty of perjury that I was tearing our family apart. The precision was chilling. Tessa paused, the sound of her rapid typing echoing through the speaker. She had found a secondary attachment buried deep at the bottom of the electronic file. It was a sworn statement of residency. The document formally declared that Grant Mercer and his minor son were the sole remaining occupants of the property, and that the wife had voluntarily vacated the premises with absolutely no intention of returning. Tessa noted that family court judges see these boilerplate forms every single day, but this specific phrasing felt entirely wrong. It was too rigid, too commercially focused for a standard domestic dispute. She pointed out that a document legally proving sole occupancy has massive, tangible value far beyond a messy divorce proceeding. It is the exact type of document a financial institution demands when assessing the risk profile of a residential asset for a major loan. My mind snapped back to a Tuesday evening exactly 3 weeks ago, as Grant had walked into the kitchen holding his tablet computer. He had casually mentioned needing my eyes on some mundane paperwork, muttering vague, dismissive phrases about refinancing housekeeping and annual home insurance verifications. I had been exhausting myself over a massive vendor compliance audit at work and was operating on 3 hours of sleep. I had barely glanced at the glowing screen. I remembered swiping through 3 pages of dense legal jargon, nodding, and handing the device back to him. I was absolutely certain I had not digitally signed anything. I had simply scrolled. But Grant had presented the device, established the context of financial paperwork, and noted the date and time of my physical presence near the document. I told Tessa to immediately stop looking at the family court angle and start digging into the municipal property records. I instructed her to look for pending transactions, title searches, anything moving against the deed of the house in the last 48 hours. 15 minutes later, the silence on the line broke. Tessa had found it. A completely unknown entity operating under the name Blue Lantern Settlement Services had just initiated a massive title search and filed preliminary paperwork for a high-yield bridge mortgage and a total cash-out refinance on our home address. The second wave of shock hit me, entirely eclipsing the first. This was not about Grant wanting to win a divorce or punish me for our ongoing arguments about his business. This was a desperate, high-speed financial extraction. But there was a massive, fatal flaw in his design, a detail he had either foolishly forgotten or arrogantly assumed he could bypass. We did not buy that house together. When we closed on the property 5 years ago, the vast majority of the down payment and equity came directly from my personal savings, accumulated long before I ever met Grant Mercer. I had structured the purchase through a private limited liability company I exclusively controlled. Named Walsh Harbor Holdings, legally, the house was heavily encumbered by my premarital asset structure. Grant could not just walk into a bank and leverage the property on his own signature. If he was using the house as collateral for a massive commercial bridge loan, he absolutely required my explicit legal consent. He needed me to sign away my rights to the equity, to legally subordinate my interest to the new lender. The entire map of the battlefield suddenly illuminated in my mind. The pieces locked together with sickening, mathematical precision. The declined credit card at the drive-thru, the revoked smart home access, the change of residency email from the county, the appraiser walking out of my house, the locksmith changing the deadbolts, the temporary protective order barring me from the property. Grant was not trying to divorce me. A real divorce would trigger a meticulous, slow-moving forensic accounting of all our assets, which was the absolute last thing a man secretly bleeding money would ever want. This was a corporate raid disguised as a domestic dispute. He needed a bridge loan immediately to save whatever failing business venture he was desperately hiding. To get the loan, he needed to pledge the house. To pledge the house, he needed my signature, which he knew I would never willingly give. So, he had to forge my consent or bypass it entirely through a fraudulent remote closing process. But a cautious lender or a title company would eventually call the house, send an inspector, or require a direct verbal verification. Grant could not risk me answering the door or picking up the home phone and discovering the massive, secret debt he was quietly placing on our roof. He needed a perfect, legally documented excuse for why the wife was suddenly unavailable to speak to the bank, why she was no longer living at the residence, and why all communication had to be routed exclusively through his attorneys. The fake domestic crisis was the ultimate cover story. The protective order was his impenetrable shield against the bank compliance department. He was using the heavy, blunt machinery of the family court system to legitimize and conceal his financial fraud. I sat back in the rigid hotel chair and stared at the dark city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling window. The hunted had stopped running. I had turned around, looked down, and realized I was holding the exact, detailed blueprints of the trap my husband had built. Grant thought he had successfully evicted an emotional, unstable wife. He did not realize he had just locked a risk management auditor in a room with a high-speed internet connection and unlimited access to his paper trail. Grant had always sold a very specific, meticulously crafted image to the world. He was the founder and managing partner of Mercer Ridge Advisory, a boutique real estate capital brokerage that operated out of a sleek, glass-walled office in the premier financial district of the city. To the casual observer, and certainly to the affluent members of our social circle, he was a master of the universe. He drove a leased European sports car, wore bespoke suits imported directly from Italy, and spoke in a constant, exhausting stream of high-level financial buzzwords. He projected the absolute aura of a man who controlled every single digit on his balance sheets. But beneath that carefully manicured exterior, Grant was not a titan of industry. He was essentially just a middleman playing a highly leveraged, incredibly dangerous shell game, and right now, the shells were completely empty. His firm was actively drowning in a luxury townhouse development situated on the rapidly gentrifying east side of the city. He had aggressively convinced a syndicate of retail investors to back the project, promising them secure double-digit returns within 18 months. But construction had stalled violently due to massive cost overruns, poor contractor management, and soaring material prices. He was bleeding cash at a catastrophic rate. If he did not secure a massive injection of bridge capital by the end of this current week, the entire development would trigger a chain default. The primary construction loan would be called in. The retail investors would panic and file immediate lawsuits, and the pristine, untouchable reputation Grant had spent his entire adult life cultivating would completely vaporize. He was staring directly down the barrel of total professional and financial ruin. Tessa called me back just after midnight. She had bypassed the family court entirely and dug straight into the commercial underwriting pipeline. Through a contact at a regional title clearinghouse, she had obtained a digital copy of the preliminary loan file Grant had submitted to his shadowy lender. The contents were a masterclass in document manipulation. To secure a cash-out refinance on a property where the primary equity holder was an uncooperative spouse, Grant had weaponized the legal system. The file contained a sworn declaration stating that the house was his sole primary residence. In a separate, highly irregular addendum attached specifically for the underwriter, he had formally documented that his wife had permanently abandoned the home, but the truly brilliant, sociopathic detail was the safety flag. The file explicitly instructed the bank that due to a volatile and legally documented family safety issue, absolutely no direct contact should be made with the wife. Standard banking compliance strictly requires a verbal or written verification of occupancy and consent from all parties listed on a property deed. Grant knew the exact moment a bank underwriter called my cell phone to verify a multi-million-dollar loan. His entire scheme would instantly detonate. The emergency protective order he had obtained from the judge that afternoon was never intended to protect him from me. It was a manufactured, State-sanctioned barrier designed exclusively to block the compliance department of the lending institution from calling me. He had literally used the county sheriff as a customer service firewall. I opened my encrypted cloud storage drive and retrieved a folder labeled with a date from 4 years ago. It contained our comprehensive estate planning documents, drafted during a brief period when Grant and I actually pretended we were building a united, transparent future. I emailed a specific subfolder directly to Tessa. Buried deep within the boilerplate language of trusts and asset allocations was a post-nuptial appendix we had signed at the strict insistence of my personal wealth manager. The clause was incredibly dense, but its function was absolute and unforgiving. It stipulated that if either party attempted to fraudulently encumber, leverage, or secretly borrow against the separate, premarital assets of the other party, the offending spouse would immediately and permanently forfeit any and all rights to claim a share of the appreciation of those assets in the event of a divorce. I heard Tessa draw a sharp breath over the phone line as her eyes scanned the digital document. Grant had likely forgotten this obscure addendum completely, dismissing it as standard legal friction during a time when his business was actually solvent. Or perhaps his current, blinding desperation had simply erased his memory of the long-term consequences. But Tessa understood its power instantly. She called it the final nail. We did not just have solid proof that he was lying to a family court judge. We had a binding, signed contract that legally stripped him of hundreds of thousands of dollars in property equity the absolute second we proved his loan application was fraudulent. He had built a complex trap to steal the equity in my house, but he had unknowingly wired the detonator directly to his own bank account. As the financial mechanics of his betrayal became entirely clear, the role of my mother-in-law finally snapped into sharp focus. Judith Mercer was a woman fiercely protective of her family name, but she was not a fool. When she stood on my porch at 6 o'clock that morning, she had not called the police. She had not confronted her son and demanded he stop his reckless, illegal behavior. She had merely whispered a warning to me and driven away into the dark. I realized then that whatever she had discovered the night before was far too massive to be contained by a simple family argument. She had seen the loan applications lying on a desk. She had seen the forged signatures or the fraudulent occupancy declarations. She knew her son was crossing a fatal line from domestic manipulation straight into federal mortgage fraud. She could not bring herself to actively destroy her own child by turning him into the authorities, but her conscience, or perhaps her own finely tuned survival instinct, would not allow her to watch me walk blindly into a staged crime scene. Her silence was a terrible, cowardly kind of complicity, but her warning was the only reason I was currently sitting in a secure hotel room holding all the administrative cards, rather than screaming helplessly from the back of a police cruiser. Tessa asked if she should immediately file an emergency injunction to freeze the title process and blow the entire loan out of the water before morning. I looked at the glowing screen of my laptop, the endless columns of data, and the signed legal traps shining in the dim, sterile hotel room. I felt a profound, chilling sense of calm wash over my entire body. I told her no. We were going to do absolutely nothing. We were not going to make a single sound or file a single motion. If we struck now, Grant could claim it was a massive misunderstanding, a mere paperwork error handled poorly by an overzealous attorney. He would retreat, regroup, and find another, quieter way to bleed me dry. I needed him fully, legally committed. I needed him to sign the final closing documents under penalty of perjury. I needed the fraudulent money to actually attempt to move into his corporate accounts. The most dangerous fraudster in the world is the one who wakes up on the second day believing his plan worked perfectly. I wanted Grant Mercer to sleep soundly tonight. I wanted him to wake up tomorrow morning, look at his phone, and believe he had successfully erased me from my own life. I would let him step entirely into the elaborate trap he had built, and only when the heavy steel door locked firmly behind him would I finally turn on the lights. The next morning, I did not march into the Human Resources Department to weep about my fractured marriage. I went in to systematically build an impenetrable audit trail. I sat across from the Regional Director of Human Resources at Halcyon Freight Grid and submitted a formal, documented request for my own employee activity data from the previous 24 hours, though. I explained that I was the subject of a malicious legal filing and needed every single digital footprint I had left on the corporate campus. Because I was a senior director of risk management, they processed the request with absolute urgency. Within 2 hours, I possessed a certified, legally admissible dossier of my own existence. The file contained the exact timestamps of my physical security badge swiping into the underground parking garage at exactly 8:45 in the morning. It held the dense, encrypted network logs, proving my virtual private network had connected from my assigned workstation. It included the digital attendance records from 3 separate Microsoft Teams video conferences. Finally, it contained a printed, itemized receipt from the ground floor corporate cafeteria timestamped at 12:15 in the afternoon, detailing the purchase of a turkey club sandwich and a large black coffee. Grant had sworn a binding oath to a county judge that I was at home, completely out of my mind, aggressively destroying property during those exact hours. My corporate data cleanly and unemotionally proved his emergency affidavit was a work of pure, calculated fiction, but proving he lied about my whereabouts was only the first defensive layer. I needed someone who could forensically tear apart the fake electronic consent document buried inside his commercial loan file. Tessa reached outside our immediate circle and connected me with Miles Kincaid. Miles was an independent technologist who specialized exclusively in electronic signature verification and digital notary fraud. He had spent the last 12 years testifying as an expert witness in complex commercial title disputes across the state of North Carolina. I retained his services immediately, wiring him a retainer of $5,000 from a brand new, strictly isolated banking account. Miles stripped the metadata from the electronic consent form Grant had submitted to the title company. It took him less than 4 hours to locate the fatal structural flaw in my husband's plan. He called me and explained the mechanics of the fraud. The digital signature attached to the property release had not been executed from my personal mobile phone, my home tablet, or my corporate laptop. The secure audit trail embedded deeply within the document's code revealed that the signature sequence had been generated during an active remote desktop session. Miles traced the originating Internet Protocol address for that specific session. It routed directly back to a commercial server cluster located in the downtown financial district. It was the exact local network registered to the physical office suite of Mercer Ridge Advisory. Grant had literally forged my legal consent while sitting comfortably at his own desk. I took the forensic report from Miles and cross-referenced it with the data exported from our smart home security application. The application log showed that my primary administrative rights to the digital locks and the exterior cameras were manually revoked by the master user at precisely 12 o'clock in the afternoon. However, the official timestamp printed on the emergency protective order showed that the on-call judge had not actually signed the legal document until 2:30 in the afternoon. The timeline was devastatingly clear. Grant had digitally locked me out of the house 2.5 hours before he even possessed the legal authority from the court to do so. This single detail proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the lockout was not a desperate, frantic response to a suddenly violent spouse. It was a predetermined administrative action executed exactly on schedule. He was treating my removal from the property like the termination of a rogue employee. While Miles secured the digital evidence regarding the title fraud, I meticulously fortified my financial perimeter. I walked into a retail branch of a completely different banking institution, one where Grant had no connections, and quietly opened a brand new individual checking account. I executed a wire transfer of exactly $35,000, the exact amount required to secure the upcoming academic year of Noah's private school tuition, moving it from our joint savings into a heavily restricted educational trust fund. I immediately halted any and all discretionary spending on my end. I purchased no luxury items, I booked no hotel spa appointments, and I made absolutely no large cash withdrawals. If Grant attempted to subpoena my new financial statements to build a narrative of sudden financial instability or erratic behavior, he would find absolutely nothing but mundane grocery receipts, gas station charges, and standard hotel room fees. Beyond the rigid control of my finances, I enforced a total, suffocating communications blackout. I did not send Grant a single angry text message demanding an explanation for his betrayal. I did not post cryptic, emotional updates on any of my social media profiles. I did not call my sister or my college roommates to aggressively vent about my husband's sociopathic actions. Tessa had been incredibly clear and strict on this specific point. In a highly volatile family law dispute, a panicked, reactive, screaming spouse is incredibly easy to paint as an unstable spouse. Absolute, disciplined silence is the ultimate, undeniable proof of sanity. I became a complete ghost in my own social circle, offering them absolutely zero material to use against me. This heavy, deliberate silence was finally broken on the third day by a text message from a number I had not expected to see. It was Judith. She requested that we meet privately at an old, faded diner located just across the county line, miles away from the upscale bistros and country clubs of our usual social orbit. I drove out to the location during my lunch break, the scent of old grease and burnt coffee hitting me the second I walked through the glass doors. When I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from my mother-in-law, I was genuinely shocked by her physical appearance. The impeccable, polished armor of the Mercer family matriarch was completely gone. She wore a simple beige knit sweater. Her hair was pulled back loosely without any styling, and the deep, dark circles under her eyes made her look 15 years older than the woman who had stood on my front porch just a few days ago. She looked exactly like a woman actively buckling under the immense weight of a terrible, toxic secret. She ordered a plain black tea and stared silently at the scratched formica table for a very long time before she finally spoke. She did not offer me a heartfelt apology. She did not beg for my forgiveness or try to defend her son. She simply handed me the missing piece of the timeline. She confessed that on Monday evening, the night before I was locked out of my home, she had stopped by our house to drop off a small gift for Noah. Grant was locked in his study on a conference call, and she had walked into the empty kitchen. Sitting completely exposed on the center of the marble island was a thick manila folder. Judith told me she had opened it. Inside the folder, she found the drafted temporary protective order, already completely filled out with my personal details, but not yet stamped by the court. Beneath the legal filing was a printed, detailed itinerary for the following day. It listed the exact arrival times for the property appraiser and the commercial locksmith. But the most damning item in the folder was a handwritten checklist clipped to the inside cover. It contained a step-by-step guide for physically staging the house. The third bullet point on the list read, "Remove personal wife items before inspection." She had stood in my kitchen and stared at the physical, documented blueprint of my eviction. She knew immediately that her son was orchestrating a massive, calculated lie to physically remove me from the property and steal the equity. But standing there under the recessed lighting, she simply could not bring herself to confront him. She could not stomach the terrifying reality of actively destroying her own son's life by exposing his fraud to the authorities. Her deep, ingrained maternal loyalty had completely paralyzed her moral compass. So, she had chosen the absolute coward's compromise. She had shown up at my house at 6 o'clock the next morning to whisper a vague, cryptic warning, desperately hoping I would somehow figure out the trap on my own without forcing her to be the one to pull the trigger. She did not ask for my forgiveness. She took a slow sip of her lukewarm black tea and looked out the greasy window toward the highway, watching the heavy transport trucks rumble past. The polished, aristocratic armor she wore to country club luncheons and charity galas was entirely absent in this bleak setting. "The men in this family," she began, her voice devoid of its usual rhythmic cadence, "have a long generational tradition of using absolute politeness to legitimize their theft." She spoke of her own marriage, detailing how she had remained perfectly silent for decades, while her late husband quietly consumed every asset and ambition she possessed, always under the noble guise of providing for the household. She admitted she had swallowed her own voice to maintain the pristine image of the Mercer name. But sitting in my kitchen the night before the ambush, looking at the meticulous, printed schedule for my forced removal, She realized she was watching the cycle repeat itself with terrifying precision. She was refusing to let the family sickness claim another victim completely blindfolded, even though her intervention was admittedly a cowardly half-measure. Judith then laid out the brutal, unvarnished reality of Grant's financial descent. Months ago, he had completely lost control of his firm. He had been quietly stacking high-interest commercial loans, aggressively borrowing against his own inflated reputation, and spinning plates that were now rapidly crashing to the ground. She recalled a private dinner party a few weeks prior, where she had accidentally overheard him talking on his phone in the hallway. He was speaking to a private equity broker, and he casually referred to my house, the property I had purchased with my own hard-earned savings, as sleeping equity. That specific phrase sent a violent shiver down my spine. It completely reduced my sanctuary, my ultimate financial independence, to nothing more than a dormant bank account waiting for him to plunder. But the most devastating revelation, the twist that truly made my blood run cold, was the true nature of the protective order. Grant was not actually planning to leave me permanently. He did not want a real divorce. A legitimate divorce would trigger a forensic accounting of his business, which would instantly expose his massive debts. Instead, the entire legal separation was a meticulously constructed theatrical performance. He needed a documented, temporary estrangement that lasted just long enough to bypass my legal consent, push the fraudulent bridge loan through the underwriting department, and inject the stolen cash into his failing townhouse project. Once the funds cleared and his business was temporarily saved, his plan was to drop the protective order, return to the house, claim he had suffered a massive, stress-induced mental breakdown, and beg for a tearful reconciliation. He would sweep the entire nightmare under the rug, expecting me to welcome him back, completely unaware that the roof over my head was now chained to a massive, hidden corporate debt. "That is exactly why I told you to stay away," Judith said, her eyes finally meeting mine across the table. It was not just out of pity. She explained that if I had ignored her cryptic morning warning and driven straight home at 5 o'clock that evening, I would have walked directly into a psychological trap. Finding a commercial locksmith, a property appraiser, and an armed police officer on my front porch would have naturally provoked extreme outrage. I would have yelled. I would have demanded answers. I would have fought aggressively to get inside my own home, and Grant would have stood there, looking perfectly calm and tragic, while the police physically restrained an out-of-control, hysterical wife. It would have given him the ultimate, undeniable documented proof he needed for his protective order. By staying away and retreating to a hotel, I had starved his fabricated narrative of the very oxygen it desperately needed to survive. I forced myself to ask about Noah. The thought of my young son caught in the middle of this sociopathic corporate play tore at my chest. Judith quickly assured me he was physically safe, currently sleeping in the guest room at her estate. But Noah was a highly observant boy, and he was already noticing the terrifying, silent gaps in his reality. He had seen the blank spaces on the hallway walls where my framed photographs used to hang. He had seen the heavy industrial tape sealing the door to my home office. When he asked his father what was happening, Grant had simply patted him on the shoulder, smiled his polished smile, and told him not to ask too many questions until everything was done. A deep, sharp ache bloomed heavily in my ribs, a visceral pain that threatened to crack my composed facade, but I absolutely refused to let it break me. I would not wage a messy, emotional war using my son as a proxy on a chaotic battlefield. I chose to protect him differently. I would wait patiently until the dust fully settled, and then I would hand him the unvarnished, perfectly documented truth. Children eventually grow up, and when they do, they fundamentally respect the parent who protected their sanity over the parent who demanded their blind loyalty. I left the diner and drove back to my sterile hotel room. The air outside felt suffocating, but my internal mind was sharper and colder than it had been in years. The moral ambiguity of the situation. My mother-in-law playing both sides. My husband orchestrating a fake divorce to steal my money. My own icy detachment felt like a thick, heavy fog. But my path through it was perfectly illuminated by data. As I opened my laptop, My secure messaging application chimed. It was Miles. He had spent the morning aggressively probing the secondary cloud backup for the internal security cameras of my house. Grant had been thorough in his erasure, but he was a real estate broker, not a professional network engineer. Miles had successfully recovered the deleted system logs. The recovered data irrefutably proved that the video files recording the central hallway, the kitchen, and the garage entrance had not been corrupted or accidentally overwritten by a system glitch. They had been manually and intentionally deleted from the master console at exactly 5:45 in the evening, a mere 15 minutes before my shift at the logistics company officially ended. Grant had physically wiped the visual evidence of his staging process right before he expected me to arrive and trigger his trap. I instantly forwarded the recovered data logs to Tessa. I fully expected her to immediately draft an aggressive motion to quash the protective order based on the deliberate destruction of evidence. Instead, she called me a few minutes later with a legal strategy that took my breath away with its sheer, vindictive brilliance. We were not going to stop the pending loan application. Not yet. Stopping it now would simply scare the title company away and leave Grant with nothing more than a judicial slap on the wrist for submitting inaccurate paperwork. Instead, Tessa was actively drafting a formal preservation of evidence demand, legally known as a litigation hold. She was preparing to serve it directly to the corporate legal department of Blue Lantern Settlement Services and the underwriting division of the primary commercial lender. The demand letter would not explicitly accuse them of participating in fraud. It would simply inform them that a highly contentious pending legal dispute currently involved the specific property address in question. The letter would legally compel both institutions to immediately freeze and permanently retain every single email, digital signature sequence, recorded phone call, and internal compliance checklist related to Grant's specific loan file. They would be legally bound by federal compliance standards to preserve the very evidence my husband was currently using to destroy his own position. Tessa explained the cold beauty of the maneuver. By forcing the financial institutions to aggressively lock down their own internal data architecture, we were guaranteeing that when Grant finally signed the ultimate closing documents, every single lie he told would be permanently archived on the heavily regulated servers of a federal bank. We were effectively turning his own chosen financial accomplices into our most reliable, unassailable star witnesses. The temporary trap he had built to cage me was rapidly transforming into a heavy steel vault, and he was happily locking the heavy door entirely from the inside. The county courthouse in downtown Charlotte smelled faintly of industrial floor wax and stale anxiety. It was early Monday morning, the scheduled time for the preliminary hearing regarding the emergency protective order. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4 swung closed behind me, sealing us inside a space where truth is often entirely secondary to the performance of credibility. I took my seat at the heavy wooden respondent table next to Tessa. Across the aisle, sitting with perfect calculated posture, was my husband. Grant had dressed specifically for the narrative he intended to sell. He wore a matte charcoal suit, deliberately leaving his expensive silk pocket squares and heavy luxury watch at home. He wanted to project the image of a grounded, responsible father who had been reluctantly forced into a devastating legal corner by an unstable partner. His shoulders were slightly slumped, conveying a profound, tragic exhaustion. When the conservative, silver-haired judge took the bench and called the docket, Grant approached the witness stand with the hesitant, heavy steps of a man carrying the absolute weight of a broken family. Under the gentle, guiding questions of his own highly paid attorney, Grant painted a masterpiece of marital fiction. He spoke in a low, measured voice, occasionally pausing to take a steadying breath as if the emotional toll was almost too much to bear. He testified under oath that I had been exhibiting severe signs of stress and erratic behavior for several months. He claimed that on the morning of the incident, I had repeatedly and violently stated I wanted out of the house and out of the marriage. He looked directly at the judge with a pained expression and swore that I had voluntarily abandoned the property that day, forcing him to take immediate, drastic measures to secure the physical environment for our young son. He framed the changed locks and the sudden residential transition not as a hostile eviction, but as a desperate act of paternal protection. Sitting at the defense table, my face remained a mask of absolute frozen stone. The urge to stand up and scream, to hurl my corporate attendance records at his face, was a physical burning sensation in my throat. But Tessa placed a firm, cool hand on my forearm, silently demanding complete discipline. When it was Tessa's turn to cross-examine him, she did not dramatically reveal our hidden cache of digital evidence. She did not accuse him of mortgage fraud or mention the fake corporate title company. She approached the podium with a calm, almost bored demeanor. Her strategy was brilliant and entirely terrifying. She simply asked him a series of very short, highly specific, closed-ended questions, forcing him to hammer his own lies firmly into the permanent court transcript. She asked him what exact hour he believed I had permanently vacated the premises. Grant, confident and untested, stated I had packed a bag and left shortly after 8 in the morning. Tessa nodded slowly, making a quiet note on her legal pad. She asked him what time he had personally called the commercial locksmith. He testified he made the call in a state of panic around 1 in the afternoon. She then asked him about the property appraiser I had seen leaving the house. Grant smoothly lied again, claiming the man was simply a routine insurance adjuster whose annual visit had been scheduled weeks in advance, completely unrelated to the domestic crisis of the day. With every polite, simple question, Tessa was silently drawing a heavy red circle around his perjury. She was meticulously laying down the rigid boundaries of the trap. She asked him to state, for the permanent record, his legal basis for describing me as a non-resident. Grant looked straight ahead and swore that I had verbally surrendered my residency and physically removed my essential belongings. Tessa thanked him, offered no further questions, and calmly returned to her seat. I waited for the judge to instantly recognize the sheer absurdity of Grant's perfectly polished narrative. I waited for the gavel to fall and for my home to be immediately returned to me. But the American family court system does not operate on sudden, cinematic justice. It operates on an overwhelming abundance of caution, especially when a child is involved and temporary safety orders are on the line. The judge looked down from his elevated bench, his expression unreadable. He noted that the allegations were serious and required a much more thorough examination than a brief morning hearing could provide. He ruled that he was extending the temporary protective order for another 14 days until a full, comprehensive evidentiary trial could be scheduled. The air rushed entirely out of my lungs. The gavel struck the sound block with a dull, heavy thud. It felt exactly like a physical blow. Despite knowing the absolute truth, despite holding the digital keys to Grant's complete destruction, I had still lost the first round. It was a crushing, breathless realization. In this specific arena, the person who tells the most reasonable-sounding, easily digestible story often wins the initial step, regardless of the objective facts. I had to walk out of that courtroom and return to my sterile hotel room while the man who had stolen my life returned to my house. The hallway outside the courtroom was crowded with pacing lawyers and whispering couples. Tessa stepped away toward the large window overlooking the street to answer an urgent call from her firm. I stood alone near the heavy stone pillars, staring blankly at the marble floor, trying to swallow the bitter, metallic taste of the temporary defeat. I heard the distinct, confident rhythm of Grant's leather shoes approaching before I saw him. He stopped just a few feet away, safely outside the immediate hearing distance of the scattered bystanders. When I looked up, the tragic, heartbroken father from the witness stand had completely vanished. The mask had slipped just enough to reveal the cold, calculating broker underneath. He offered me a small, patronizing smile and lowered his voice to a smooth, confidential murmur. He told me that all of this courtroom drama was completely unnecessary and terribly damaging to our son. He proposed a quiet, elegant settlement right there in the echoing hallway. He offered to lease me a luxury condominium in the most expensive building downtown, fully paid for an entire year. He promised a very generous, uncontested monthly support arrangement. He said we could save our reputations, save our son from a drawn-out legal war, and walk away clean. There was only one single condition attached to his sudden, overwhelming generosity. He told me I just needed to sign a standard release form relinquishing my specific claims to the Dilworth property, effectively signing the deed entirely over to him by the end of the business day. I stared at his perfectly styled hair and his expensive collar. For a fleeting second, the exhaustion of the past week almost made the offer sound like a peaceful escape route. But my risk management training instantly overrode my fatigue. I looked past his smooth words and analyzed his exact timing. Why would a man who had just successfully secured a 14-day legal victory from a judge immediately step into the hallway and offer a massive, expensive financial concession to the loser? The answer illuminated the corridor like a sudden flash of lightning. He was absolutely desperate. The 14-day delay was a total disaster for him. His shadow lender was not going to wait 2 weeks for a judge to finalize a messy domestic dispute. The bridge loan required clean, unencumbered collateral right now. By extending the legal limbo, the judge had inadvertently placed a massive, ticking time bomb directly under Grant's failing real estate project. He needed my legal signature to clear the title today, and he was terrified that his fake protective order was not going to hold the bank off long enough. His impatience was the very first visible crack in his flawless, controlled exterior. I did not yell at him. I did not call him a fraud. I simply looked him directly in the eyes, gave him a perfectly blank, utterly polite smile, and told him I would see him at the evidentiary trial. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the vast marble hallway, the heavy silence of my refusal echoing loudly in his ears. Late that evening, rain began to lash heavily against the thick glass windows of my high-rise hotel room. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, reviewing the municipal property codes, when my secure messaging application flashed with an incoming file from Tessa. The message contained no text, only a forwarded email chain. The original sender was Judith. She had quietly accessed a discarded tablet device Grant had left at her estate and pulled a deeply buried communication thread between Grant and the senior underwriter of the private mezzanine lending firm. I opened the document and read the sharp, aggressive exchanges regarding the collapsing townhouse development and the desperate need for immediate liquidity. The underwriter was demanding harder assets, refusing to accept the projected future value of half-built construction sites. And then, right in the middle of the glowing screen, I saw the exact words my husband had typed to secure his financial survival, referring to the home I had bought, the home where I had raised our child, the home he had meticulously locked me out of just days prior. He had written a single, devastating sentence to the bank. "Do not worry about the primary residence." The message read, "I am handling the wife this week, and the house is the cleanest collateral left." I sat alone in the dark room, the blue light of the screen casting a cold shadow across my face. Those 6 words were infinitely colder, infinitely more violent than any physical blow or screaming insult. He had not just stopped loving me, he had fundamentally reclassified me. I was no longer a human being, a partner, or a mother in his eyes. I was simply a minor administrative obstacle standing between him and his cleanest collateral. I slowly closed the laptop, the last lingering trace of marital grief completely burning away, replaced entirely by a pure, refined, and absolute focus. The temporary legal arrangement dictated that I was permitted exactly one 15-minute phone call with my son every single evening. The conversations were always strained, shadowed by the unspoken reality that Grant was likely sitting in the same room, monitoring every single word Noah said. I kept my voice incredibly light, asking about his history projects and his soccer practice, desperate to maintain some illusion of normalcy for him. But on Wednesday night, Noah let a seemingly insignificant detail slip through the carefully guarded domestic perimeter. He sounded confused as he casually asked me why I had told Maria, our longtime housekeeper, to take down all the framed family photographs from the ground floor hallway, before he even left for school that morning. He said his father told him the walls were being prepped for a fresh coat of paint, but the painters had never arrived. We had completely repainted the foyer less than a year ago. There was absolutely no scheduled maintenance. That tiny, innocent observation from my 13-year-old son hit me with the force of a freight train. I immediately called Tessa. We both realized simultaneously that the missing pictures on the wall were not just a petty, vindictive gesture designed to erase my memory from the house. They were a strict functional requirement for the commercial appraisal process. When an independent appraiser evaluates a property for a massive cash-out refinance, they are required by federal lending guidelines to take comprehensive, wide-angle photographs of every single room. Those photographs are then permanently uploaded to the bank underwriter to verify the physical condition and the occupancy status of the asset. If the underwriter saw walls covered in joyful pictures of a smiling wife or feminine clothing hanging prominently in the master closet, it would instantly contradict Grant's sworn declaration that he was a newly single father living completely alone. The entire house had to be visually sanitized and clinically staged for the camera lens, and it had to be done before the appraiser walked through the front door. Because Grant had manually wiped the internal security footage from our personal server, he arrogantly believed he had successfully destroyed the timeline of his staging process. But Miles Kincaid, the forensic data specialist I had hired, did not rely exclusively on internal networks. If the inside of the house was entirely blind, Miles simply turned his attention to the outside world. Within 48 hours, Miles had legally acquired the digital metadata and video files from two distinct external sources. The first was a motion-activated smart doorbell camera mounted on the front porch of our immediate next-door neighbor. The second was a GPS-enabled dashboard camera pulled from a commercial grocery delivery van that had been parked on our street that specific morning. By syncing the timestamps of the recovered video files, Miles built an irrefutable, minute-by-minute visual ledger of the activity occurring on my driveway. The high-definition footage showed Maria, the housekeeper, carrying heavy cardboard boxes out to the garage at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. It showed the commercial appraiser arriving in his gray sedan and walking through my front door at exactly 11:45 in the morning. It showed the locksmith van pulling up to the curb at 1:15 in the afternoon. Every single one of these physical, undeniable alterations to my home and my residency occurred hours before the on-call county judge finally stamped and signed the emergency protective order at 2:30 in the afternoon. Grant had not reacted to a sudden legal mandate. He had illegally executed the lockout and the property appraisal while I still possessed the absolute, unencumbered legal right to occupy my own home. Simultaneously, the aggressive litigation hold Tessa had placed on the financial institutions began to bear massive fruit. The compliance department at the title clearinghouse, absolutely terrified of being implicated in a federal investigation, formally surrendered their internal backup files regarding Grant's pending transaction. Tessa forwarded the heavily redacted document dump to my secure laptop. Buried deep inside the communication logs was a standard processing checklist used by the title officers. Next to the mandatory field requiring verbal spousal consent, a manual override code had been entered. Below it was a typed, highly specific internal note that read, "Spouse unavailable. Safety issue flagged. Proceed through counsel only." The truly horrifying detail was the signature attached to that specific electronic note. It was not signed by Grant. It was signed by a 23-year-old junior administrative assistant who worked at the front desk of Mercer Ridge Advisory. Grant had not just lied to a judge. He had actively ordered his own young employee to submit a fabricated domestic violence flag to a federally regulated financial institution as a routine business tactic. He had weaponized the concept of family risk to intentionally bypass standard anti-fraud verifications. It was the exact moment the entire situation escalated from a manipulative, bitter divorce strategy into a highly documented, multi-count felony wire fraud conspiracy. The final, devastating piece of physical evidence did not come from a forensic data sweep or a subpoena. It came wrapped in a small velvet pouch, quietly delivered to my hotel concierge by a private courier hired by Judith. Inside the pouch was an outdated, heavy smartphone that had previously belonged to her late husband. Judith had always possessed a paranoid habit of using the old, disconnected device to take physical photographs of important documents or suspicious paperwork she found lying around her house, keeping them completely off her primary iCloud account. I charged the device, entered the passcode she had provided, and opened the digital gallery. The most recent image was a slightly blurry, off-center photograph taken in my own kitchen. It captured a section of the marble island and the edge of a half-empty coffee cup, but sitting squarely in the center of the frame was the thick manila folder Judith had warned me about. The camera lens was sharp enough to read the printed schedule clipped to the cover. It clearly stated, in bold black ink, that the property appraisal inspection was strictly scheduled for 11:30 in the morning, directly followed by the locksmith at 1 in the afternoon. Staring at that glowing photograph, the absolute deepest, most profound layer of my pain finally settled into my bones. For days, a tiny, irrational part of my heart had desperately tried to convince me that perhaps Grant had simply snapped under the immense, crushing pressure of his failing business. Perhaps he had panicked, made a terrible, impulsive mistake, and accidentally gone entirely too far. But the printed schedule completely eradicated that comforting lie. Grant did not lose his temper. He did not suffer a temporary lapse in judgment. He had opened a spreadsheet, analyzed the logistical requirements of his fraud, and mapped out my complete erasure from his life down to the exact 15-minute intervals. He had calculated exactly how long it would take the housekeeper to hide my photographs, exactly when the appraiser needed to capture the staged emptiness of my home, and exactly when the new locks needed to be installed to ensure I could not return. He had managed the destruction of our marriage with the exact same cold, administrative precision he used to manage his real estate portfolios. Yet, as the tears finally threatened to break my rigid composure, my professional training surged forward and grabbed the wheel. The sheer, sociopathic perfection of his timeline was incredibly painful to witness as a wife, but it was the absolute greatest gift I could ever receive as an auditor. In complex fraud litigation, the hardest thing to prove to a jury or a judge is intent. Defendants always claim ignorance, accidental oversight, or a sudden, chaotic misunderstanding. But you cannot accidentally schedule a locksmith, an appraiser, and a perjury submission in a perfect, sequential cascade. His extreme, arrogant carefulness had provided me with the ultimate weapon. I did not just have a collection of suspicious coincidences, I had a seamless, impenetrable chain of calculated intent. It was a narrative so mathematically perfect, so deeply supported by external video, internal banking logs, and his own printed schedules, that it could be easily and lethally explained to a conservative family court judge, a federal banking regulator, and every single neighbor who had watched me get escorted off my own driveway. He had built a flawless machine to destroy me, but he had left the comprehensive instruction manual sitting right on the kitchen counter. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, cutting chill that matched the atmosphere inside courtroom 4. This was not a routine scheduling check. This was the full evidentiary hearing. It also happened to be the exact calendar day the commercial lending institution was scheduled to wire the final, saving approval for the bridge loan Grant so desperately needed. He had synchronized his entire life around this specific 24-hour window. If he survived this morning with the protective order intact, the funds would release by 3 in the afternoon, successfully rescuing his sinking townhouse development from total default. He walked into the room, radiating the quiet, polished confidence of a man who firmly believed he had outrun the clock. He had absolutely no idea the clock had been rewired. Tessa did not ease into the proceedings. The moment the judge called the matter to order, she stood up and immediately began introducing our exhibits. She did not raise her voice or employ theatrical courtroom tactics. She simply unleashed an absolute, suffocating avalanche of corporate data. She submitted my human resources attendance confirmations, the virtual private network login logs, the parking garage entry swipes, and the cafeteria receipts. Next came the forensic data recovery from Miles. She handed the bailiff the certified reports, detailing the manually deleted internal camera footage, the external dashboard camera timelines, and the precise moment my smart home administrative access was illegally revoked. The heavy binder of evidence hit the judge's wooden bench with a profound, terrifying thud. When Grant took the witness stand, His immaculate demeanor showed the very first microscopic fractures of panic. Tessa approached the podium. She reminded him he was under oath and asked him to repeat his core assertion from the preliminary hearing. She demanded he state, one final time for the permanent record, exactly how and why I had vacated the marital residence. Grant swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward his own counsel, but he had no choice but to double down on his established lie. He stated that I had voluntarily packed my bags and abandoned the property in a state of extreme distress. Tessa smiled. It was a cold, lethal expression. She pulled up the smart lock access logs and the neighborhood camera metadata on the primary courtroom monitor. She pointed out that his timeline was physically impossible. She showed the court, step by step, that the electronic locks were changed, the internal cameras were wiped, and the property was heavily staged by outside contractors hours before my shift at the logistics company even ended. She methodically stripped away his narrative of a chaotic domestic dispute, exposing the sterile, undeniable mechanics of a premeditated eviction. He had prepared the house as an empty crime scene while I was sitting at my corporate desk, but the pressure did not just come from our side of the aisle. Tessa had quietly issued a strict subpoena earlier in the week. Sitting in the back row of the gallery was the senior compliance counsel for the commercial lending institution. When called to the stand, the corporate attorney was visibly furious about being dragged into a messy family court dispute. Tessa asked him a single, devastating line of questioning. She asked why his massive financial institution had failed to follow standard federal guidelines requiring direct verbal verification from the spouse on a multi-million-dollar refinance application. The counsel adjusted his glasses, opened his briefcase, and read directly from Grant's internal loan file. He testified that the bank had bypassed the standard verification protocols strictly because the applicant had submitted a formal, documented flag stating there was an active, severe safety issue in the home. The file explicitly requested that all communication with the wife be routed exclusively through legal counsel to prevent a violent domestic escalation. Grant's face drained of all color. His private financial fraud was now a matter of public judicial record. The walls were rapidly closing in, but the absolute final blow came from the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. The doors swung open, and Judith walked slowly down the center aisle. She wore her familiar, impeccable cream blazer, her posture rigidly perfect. When she took the oath and sat in the witness chair, the entire Mercer side of the gallery fell completely silent. Grant stared at his mother in absolute, uncomprehending horror. Tessa asked her to describe the events of Tuesday morning. Judith did not look at her son. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the judge. She testified that she had driven to my house at 6 o'clock in the morning specifically to warn me not to return. When asked why, she stated with absolute, unwavering clarity that her son required my total absence for the entire day. He needed the physical space to make the home look as though I had completely vanished, all to satisfy the visual requirements of a commercial property appraisal he was conducting behind my back. She did not embellish. She did not cry. She delivered the truth with the lethal precision of a woman who had finally decided to burn down the corrupt legacy of her own family. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Tessa moved in for the final, absolute kill. She submitted the signed post-nuptial addendum into evidence. She explained to the judge that this case was no longer a simple dispute over temporary residency or a standard marital disagreement. It was a documented, thoroughly executed attempt to fraudulently encumber my separate, premarital assets using perjured affidavits and fake safety protocols. The legal clause explicitly dictated that Grant's fraudulent actions immediately triggered a total forfeiture of his rights to any equity in the Dilworth property. The dispute over who got to stay in the house was over. The reality of who tried to steal the house using false records was now the only thing that mattered. The conservative judge, who had previously granted Grant the benefit of the doubt, looked down at the mountain of irrefutable data, the banking testimony, and the mother's stunning confession. His expression shifted rapidly from judicial neutrality to absolute, furious disgust. He did not merely adjust the temporary order, he completely vacated the core mandate, immediately and permanently restoring my full, unhindered legal access to my home. Furthermore, he explicitly stated on the record that he was opening the floor for severe financial sanctions against Grant and his legal team for the blatant, malicious misrepresentation of facts to the court. As the heavy wooden gavel slammed down, finalizing Grant's defeat in the courtroom, his professional life simultaneously disintegrated. The senior compliance counsel for the lender, having just testified under oath to the fraudulent safety flags, stepped out into the marble hallway and immediately made a frantic phone call to his underwriting department. By the time I walked out of the courthouse doors, the massive bridge loan Grant so desperately needed was officially frozen pending a comprehensive, multi-agency fraud review. The capital pipeline was instantly severed. The Mercer Ridge Advisory Townhouse project, starved of its required cash injection, was left hanging entirely over the edge of a massive financial abyss, completely unsalvageable. The elaborate, multi-layered trap Grant had built to completely destroy my life had violently snapped backward, shattering every single aspect of his own. The collapse of Grant Mercer did not happen in slow motion. It happened with the terrifying, instantaneous velocity of a severed elevator cable. The moment the gavel struck the wooden block on that Friday morning, the intricate, highly leveraged ecosystem of his professional life began to violently tear itself apart. It was a chain reaction that moved far faster than even my most aggressive risk management models could have ever predicted. By Monday afternoon, the fictitious title company, desperate to avoid a catastrophic federal audit, formally withdrew from the transaction and severed all ties. The commercial lender did not just freeze the bridge loan. Their compliance department filed a formal report of suspected mortgage fraud with state regulators. The absolute fatal blow landed less than 48 hours later. A primary financial backer of the failing townhouse project caught wind of the frozen collateral and the emergency court rulings. The investor immediately filed a massive, multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit against Mercer Ridge Advisory, alleging severe misrepresentation of corporate assets and breach of fiduciary duty. The man who had spent his entire adult life positioning himself as the smartest person in every boardroom was suddenly reduced to a massive corporate liability. His business partners, terrified of the impending legal blast radius, ruthlessly locked him out of the firm he had founded. Grant was stripped of his executive access. He was unceremoniously ordered by his own board of directors to immediately surrender his corporate laptop, his digital communication archives, and every single piece of ledger data he possessed. While his professional empire burned to the ground, Tessa systematically dismantled his remaining leverage in our divorce proceedings. She did not hesitate. She officially activated the penalty clause buried deep within our post-nuptial addendum. By submitting the court transcripts proving his fraudulent attempt to secretly encumber my separate property, she legally severed his right to claim a single dollar of the appreciation value of the Dilworth estate. The house was instantly and permanently removed from the marital asset pool. It could no longer be used as a bargaining chip, a hostage, or a financial life raft for his sinking debts. He walked away with absolutely nothing but the legal fees he now owed his attorneys. My return to the property was not marked by victorious screaming, emotional breakdowns, or dramatic cinematic declarations. I arrived late on a Tuesday afternoon, accompanied by a county sheriff deputy who was strictly assigned to enforce the newly instated occupancy orders. The house was quiet. The air inside felt heavy and stagnant, smelling faintly of the chemical cleaning supplies the housekeeper had used during the staging process. I walked slowly down the central hallway, my footsteps echoing against the polished hardwood floor. I stopped and looked at the long, empty stretch of wall directly outside the formal dining room. The framed family photographs were still missing, likely shoved into a dark cardboard box in the garage, but on the pale beige paint, I could clearly see the faint, rectangular outlines of dust where the frames used to hang. I stood there for a very long time, staring at those empty geometric shapes. It was in that profound, echoing silence that I finally understood the true, insidious nature of betrayal. Real betrayal does not begin with a sudden, violent argument or a signed legal document. It begins much earlier. It begins the exact moment someone who claims to love you starts quietly training you to get used to the idea of being erased. I did not leave Noah in the dark. Once the immediate legal perimeter was fully secured, I brought my son back to the only home he had ever known. I made a very conscious, deliberate decision not to poison his mind with bitter emotional venom about his father. Children do not need to carry the heavy and toxic baggage of their parents' broken marriages. Instead of screaming about Grant's moral failures, I simply sat down with Noah at the kitchen island and treated him like a young adult who deserved the objective truth. I showed him the timeline. I showed him the recovered security logs, the time-stamped corporate emails, and the physical signature lines on the property deeds. I explained the mechanics of what had happened without using a single insulting adjective. I wanted him to learn the most vital lesson of his young life. I taught him that adults will very often use beautiful, polished, and noble words to perfectly disguise incredibly dirty, selfish actions. I wanted him to trust paper, process, and verifiable truth over the charming smiles of desperate men. Judith Mercer and I never fully reconciled. There was no tearful embrace, no grand forgiveness, and no return to our polite country club luncheons. She was not fully redeemed in my eyes, because her initial silence had still allowed the nightmare to begin. However, she was the only member of the Mercer dynasty who possessed the raw courage to step across the rigid boundary of her own bloodline to speak the truth in a court of law. Her testimony had been the ultimate key to my freedom. That act created a deeply complex, highly expensive resonance between us. We maintained a distant, respectful peace, acknowledging the heavy toll the truth had exacted on both of our lives. Many people in my social circle assumed I would immediately sell the Dilworth property. They thought I would want to escape the tainted memories and the ghostly echoes of the conflict, but I refused to sell. I refused to run away, and I absolutely refused to let my own sanctuary remain a permanent monument to Grant's failed war. The house was mine. I had bought it. I had defended it, and I was going to reclaim every single inch of it. Within a month, I hired a crew of contractors to completely gut the front room that Grant had used as his private study. We tore out his heavy mahogany shelves and his dark leather seating. I transformed one half of the bright, newly painted space into a dedicated, modern study room for Noah to focus on his schoolwork. The other half became my own comprehensive home office, a highly organized command center for my risk management career. It was a silent architectural declaration of exactly who possessed the true power and the absolute right to remain. On a quiet Sunday evening, months after the dust had finally settled, Noah and I were sitting on the back patio watching the sun slowly dip below the tree line. He was quiet for a long time, sipping a glass of water. Before he finally turned to me, he asked the one question that had clearly been weighing on his mind since the very beginning of the ordeal. He asked me why his grandmother had stood in the driveway that morning and told me not to go home. I looked at my son, noting how much older and wiser he seemed after navigating the wreckage of the past year. I told him that in this world, there are always people who can see the trap being built right in front of them from the very beginning. They see the danger, they recognize the deceit, but they are too compromised or too afraid to dismantle it themselves. I told him that sometimes, the absolute best those people can do is offer you a single sentence of warning. They can point to the fire, but they cannot put it out for you. The rest of the work, the fighting, the surviving, and the rebuilding is entirely up to you. The destruction of Grant Mercer was not brought about by my vengeance or my emotional fury. That is the ultimate truth of any real conflict. The thing that finally causes a traitor to collapse under his own weight is never the screaming anger of the person he betrayed. The collapse happens in the exact, terrifying moment when his carefully constructed lie is stripped of its shadows, dragged out of the dark, and forced to stand entirely alone under the blinding, unforgiving light of the truth. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, And support the channel even more by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.